Awakened Living is a 21st century movement for people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, who have a deep hunger for connected community and a divine impulse for personal and global transformation. Our mission is to encourage and inspire the awakening of human consciousness. Good evening and welcome to Awakened Living Television. My name is TJ Woodward. I'm the Minister and Spiritual Director of Awakened Living in San Francisco, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you to our show this evening. I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation this evening with our guest, Ashanna Solaris. She was on the show last week, and I've invited her to come back this evening because it just felt like we had so many more different directions we could go. And it was interesting because she and I were checking in before the show and we were like, now what was it we were going to continue? I do remember that we began the conversation of forgiveness. And our theme at Awakened Living this month is awakening joy. And in particular, awakening joy as it relates to Easter and the Easter story, whatever that means to us. Some of us perhaps grew up in a religious way, some did not. Some might relate to the origins of the Easter story, which predate Christianity. And I know that Ashanna is someone that embodies that and also has a great deal of knowledge about the origins of the Easter story. But my intention for the show this evening, seeing that it is 1 week before Easter now, is that we might delve into the topic of crucifixion and what that means in our own lives. And for me, I know that it has felt like, as I am awakening, that parts of me have felt like they were dying off, in particular parts of my ego and parts of my attachment to what I believed was real that turns out were not as solid as I once believed. So I do know that at the end of our last episode, I brought up the topic of forgiveness as something that we might explore further. So I know this evening we will allow the conversation to lead us, allow Spirit to lead us in the direction that it wants and needs to go. So Ashanna, welcome back to our show.
Thank you, TJ. It's a pleasure to be back.
Thank you. And I really am so grateful that you've chosen to be back here with me and with us this evening as we continue this conversation.
Yes.
And thank you for being a guest speaker at Awaken Living this month too, and the topic of awakening joy. And when I see you, I feel my own joy awakening, and I see you as a very
delightful.
joyful. So please take a few minutes for those who didn't watch our show last week to introduce yourself and tell our viewers a little bit about what you do and your work.
Okay, great. Well, it's wonderful to be back on your show, TJ. I really enjoyed speaking last week about the power of this time, transformation, breath, healing. And I'm a Clarity Breathwork practitioner. I helped trademark that name in 1999. And I work with students all over the world, supporting people in their healing journey, their awakening embodiment journey, and training practitioners in the healing arts. And it's my love and my passion and my path to serve those that are here to serve and to help bring more joy and healing into this world.
Wow, well, thank you. And you are succeeding in that. So thank you for your contribution. And really, I do want to take a moment before we even begin the conversation to really say thank you for trusting your inner vision and trusting your light. And you're a person who I see really embodying service on the planet.
Thank you for that reminder also, because to walk the path of spirit and a path that is not the well-traveled path,
yes,
does take a tremendous amount of courage, and sometimes we don't acknowledge that.
Yes.
We're too busy crucifying ourselves, as you said, with we're not enough, we're not good enough, we haven't achieved enough, we haven't done enough. And the fact that we have had the courage to follow a path that is a different path than, say, a regular 9-to-5 job or a regular path in the world requires a lot. It's not for the faint of heart to follow a path of healing and service in the world.
Yeah, and we both know that well. So I want to jump right in. There seem to be two topics kind of floating, and I know that you and I will find a way to blend them, and I know that they are intrinsically blended anyway. And that is this idea of crucifixion, or parts of us that must and it feels like they're dying off. So I'm going to just use that language. Parts of us that must die off in order for us to awaken to this joyful, blissful state, or to awaken. And then also, how does forgiveness play a role in that? So anything you want to say about either one of those would be great.
I mean, so many things come to mind, and I also teach a course called Awakening Your Light Body, and this journey came through one day around taking off the crown of thorns, which is the crown of our old matrix of belief that has kind of pierced the mind of all of us with that belief system of condemnation and crucifixion and that concept of original sin, of the fall from grace, that they don't actually have in the East, like the Dalai Lama. They don't have that story of original sin, of a fall from grace where we did something terribly wrong and now we are separate from a God that is outside of the world. So in that light body journey, our guides helped us to take off that crown of thorns, the crown of belief that we are separate, bad, and wrong, and to replace it with that crown of joy, the crown of what we really are, the crown of that divine self that we are. And the Easter story is a perfect story of that death of the egoic self, the death of the mind-made self, and the resurrection, the transformation into the truth of who we really are.
Wow, when you were just speaking, what occurred to me is that part of the natural process of something dying is grief.
Yes.
That is, and I know in my own journey, I'll speak from my own experience, I really believed that at one point I was going to reach a particular state and I would be free from the human experience.
Yes.
And I really thought, or I believed, that was the goal of spirituality or spiritual transformation, was to leave this human form.
Right.
Now, may be true on one level, and on another, there have been these real life experiences of me. Really, the more I awaken, the more I come to terms with the grief of, and the sadness of how long I've kept those thorns on, and there's no one holding those thorns there but me.
Right. And yet a lot of those thorns are born out of grief that we might not have been able to feel at a certain point in our lives too. And so a child, there's a famous saying, I think it's John Bradshaw, that says, a child would rather believe that they are a sinner in a world of saints than a saint in a world of sinners. Because it's more painful for the child to believe that there's something wrong with the parents. Mom and dad are dysfunctional. Then there's something, if there's something wrong with them, then I'm really in trouble. So there must be that there's something wrong with me. So part of spiritual awakening is feeling that original grief that we had and the loss that we've had, that we then covered up with the beliefs that I'm bad, I'm unworthy, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable. When we start to move those thoughts energetically, we start to also move the emotional material that's also connected to those thoughts. And tremendous grief can come up. And I'm a real proponent, it's taken a long time for me to embrace grief. They say that it's one of our most untapped resources, that in our Western culture we don't want to feel it, we want to push it aside, and yet every single one of us in our life faces grief, maybe even on a daily basis, but certainly through the death of a loved one, the death of a way of being, the death of a career. There's a lot of grief to be felt, and my experience is that when I allow myself to feel my grief, and when I support others to feel their grief, that on the other side of that grief, we talked about this last week, is tremendous love and joy and unification again.
Absolutely. And I look at the way our culture really, how we relate to death in general, and I can recognize that, of course, when I feel that there are parts of me, like the ego holds on to an old belief or an old idea or an old way of being in the world, how my own grief around that is going to be, in so many ways, there's been no model for me to recognize the power of just being with that feeling, the power of just being with the letting go of the old idea, and really honoring that there was a way of being in the world that served me well for a period of time.
And it was a survival strategy.
Yes.
And without some of these survival strategies, there's incredible despair, So we devise these strategies early on in life to help us to feel a sense of safety and connection and even euphoria. You know, I've been looking with a lot of my female clients about that vision of the knight on the white horse that's going to come, and the euphoria that came from thinking that someone would come and rescue us finally. And that could even look like Jesus will come and save us, or there's got to be someone that will come and rescue us and save us. And we can get a high on just thinking that story. But to let that story die, that there's actually someone else that's going to come and save us, and to face our aloneness, our all oneness with the divine, that's the descent that we all must go through to really be able to meet what we are. And it's the descent that most of us avoid. In fact, we live in an entire culture that avoids that descent.
Yes.
You know, and so then something has to happen in a life stream to kind of encourage that awakening process to happen.
And in that way, that's why we hear so many people talk about the cancer or the breakup or the loss of the job or the losing everything being the gift, when really it's actually not the gift. Just as when we're looking externally for something to save us, just in the same way, it's also not what actually brings about the awakening, but it's because my old ideas get stripped away, right? And thank you for that, because for me, the way I work with the Easter story preceding Easter is this idea of tomb time. You know, this idea of going into that place, really stepping into the crucifixion, and then what happens before the resurrection, which is I honor very deeply this. What you're saying is so incredible, because it's not just, like you said, the white knight, but wow, when we grew up with a spirituality or religion that believes there's someone that's going to save us, or eventually there's going to be a moment we're saved, how does that change my experience of now?
Right. And many people think that salvation lies in the afterlife. And so it doesn't really matter what I do necessarily with my life or how I treat the planet, because God is there when I die. And so that's really, you know, when we look at the Easter story and we look at its roots in ancient goddess tradition, because there was a religion of the goddess for tens of thousands of years that predated Christianity, and there was a goddess named Easter or Esther, who was a goddess of fertility and springtime and the celebration of the rebirth after winter. So winter is that dying time, that death, that time we go into the darkness. There's nothing is growing, it's all barren. But out of that death, and out of every death in our lives, comes that rebirth, comes the renewal, comes springtime. And so they say that the crucifixion was actually placed on that date of Easter to stop the pagans from going out and celebrating. But to put another story there, and there's actually controversy whether that's the real dates of his crucifixion.
Wow. You know, I was with a client recently, and obviously we don't talk about specifics, but a client that had dealt with death, and I just, the intuition came to me to ask what people told him at the funeral. What were the messages you received at the funeral? And the messages he received were, be strong for your mother, be strong for your sisters, you can get through this, no reason to be sad, just all this affirmation.
Don't feel your grief.
Don't feel your grief. And so, you know, this poor young man went through shutting down, and so much support for it, so much external support. And I think about men in our culture too.
Oh,
you know,
I was reading an article recently about men in our culture and the uprise of anxiety in men, because men have not been allowed, really, it's kind of been okay for women to be nervous or to have emotions or to fall apart, but for men to have their process. And so now there's all this kind of male anxiety and male prescription drugs that are coming out now to help men deal with their anxiety, and men needing to be able to talk about their feelings and share their vulnerability as a way to break through that.
Yeah, and
so necessary.
I just, and where we went with our process is, if you can go back to that time and imagine, what would you want to hear? And what was striking is he had no idea. He had no idea. Right,
and that's the freeze dissociation that happened at that time, is the no idea, because there can be a real checking out at the death. Was it his father, or I'm imagining it was a really important person in his life. So he was in shock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the best thing that was ever said to me when I was in grief over the loss of a loved one was, whatever you're feeling, it's appropriate.
Yes.
It was the most liberating thing for me.
So beautiful.
Whatever you're feeling is appropriate, because
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted so much to get rid of the feelings.
Right.
And really what I wanted, I didn't really want to get rid of the feelings at all.
Yeah.
What I really wanted is someone in my life that just said to me, it's okay.
It's okay to feel that way.
Yeah.
Of course you feel grief. Of course there's loss. And that's really a lot of what our work becomes, is helping ourselves and our clients, right, to complete a place where they got stuck or they got frozen, where there wasn't a conscious witness to say, it's really okay to have your feelings right now.
Yeah.
It's really okay to let that go.
So I want to really tie that in then, because that was really, in a way, it feels like a beautiful setup for how can we work with our own tomb time, or our own, like when we come to terms with, and I know something astrological is happening right now that you spoke with me about. What happens when it's time, really time for us to come to terms with the way we've been in the world, and how that limited way of thinking, and what happens when that dies off? How do we honor our own feelings around that in much the same way?
Well, I'm really all for surrendering to feeling the grief and the loss and the pain and the emotion, and allowing it to wash through us, and trusting that process. And recently I read a Hafiz poem. I wish I had brought it. Maybe I'll bring it for the next show. But it was something like, the difference between you and a saint. Like, a saint knows that God has made a fabulous checkmate move and there's no way out, and is laughing delightedly. You still think you have 1,000 serious moves to make.
Oh, I love that.
So, we still think that there's some way that we're going to win, or we're going to beat that greater power, and we're not. So the best thing to do is to surrender and allow it to take us. And if it needs to take us through the journey of our pain and our hurt and our fear and our suffering to deliver us into the truth and the heart of what we are, then so be it. And it's, I face it with a lot of humility and honoring, because for many people it's terrifying to face.
Yeah.
And so maybe our addictions have been useful to help us at a certain point, but for many of us, that point is up. And with this cardinal grand square that's coming up in this month, it's kind of coming face to face. It's really time. We are living in a time when it's really time to face how asleep we've been, how unconscious we've gone, how we've tried to avoid our pain, and start to turn towards it, lean in, face it, breathe into it. And then out of that is born the resurrection. Out of that is born the life and the way and the truth and the love, because that's what's here underneath all of our running away, all of our avoidance of what we are.
Yeah, and this is what's exciting to me, because when I live that story, rather than there's some savior that is being resurrected to save me,
Right.
there's some destination, there's some out there. When I recognize this story lives within me, and that the crucifixion is such an important part. And for me, what really helps is when I recognize in my mind that the crucifixion is part so I can get to the resurrection. Rather than that, just to recognize, to lean in and open up to what is, and to always trust, as you said, that we are on this incredible journey right now of awakening. And it may not look every moment like I had hoped, but when one of the points that is so powerful is how many ways we found an addiction to not live in the moment. And Pema Chodron says it so beautifully, that all addictions stem from this moment when I just can't be with myself. And it's, fill in 1,000 different forms of escapism. And as a culture, we're obsessed with it. We're obsessed with entertaining ourselves away from the experience of the now.
And if we can just face it, which we're learning how to do, how to just face it and be with it and allow it and honor it, then it really is our most untapped resource. And I heard you say last time that you went to India and were with Amma, and I was at Amma a while back. Every time I go to Amma, I get an amazing message, and I had hurt my foot very badly, and I was in a big process, and I got into Amma. There was like 1,000 people. I saw her walk by me, as close as we are, with that light in her eyes, and I sat down for a meditation with 1,000 people, and I heard her say directly to me, my daughter has a lot of sadness that she's not allowing herself to feel because she believes that her sadness isn't spiritual. And she believes that she needs to be happy for everybody else.
Yes.
You know, and it just was the Zen stick that hit me over the head and suddenly just brought all the grief that I had been holding, you know, to the surface to just allow it to come out. And I went home and just cried for days, you know. And since that experience, I've been learning more and more how to just surrender and allow my grief and my sadness to just come out. And every time I do, on the other side of it is waiting more expansion, more love, more of a connection and a compassion to everyone around me and to the pain that we are all facing and going through, and to the love that's there within the pain.
And what is so remarkable when I hear you tell that, even in the retelling of the story, I feel closer to you.
Yeah,
because your ability to be with that. And yet, when it comes to my own journey, what Amma said is so true so often. Oh, I shouldn't be this because I need to be so spiritual for others and be strong.
Show that I'm a positive person and put my positive energy out into the world.
Yeah.
When actually people are often more touched by our vulnerability and our realness. And when I've told this story to students, people just thank you, because we've been waiting for the permission to feel what we feel and to let it be okay to feel what we feel. So we can go ahead and give ourselves permission to feel what we feel, knowing that if we do that, we'll pass through it quickly, like a child passes through emotions very quickly. You know, but as adults, we just try to hold it all in, and we try to keep compensating, and then it turns into disease, it turns into illness, it turns into conflict in our relationships, because what we don't deal with in ourselves will take shape and form outside of us in other people.
Absolutely, we're just going to project it.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's amazing, because that is, to me, the definition of living a spiritual life. And yet, what is it? And I mean, I know I have some of my own answers, but what is it about us that believes we need to be, as you said, so positive? And yet, the positive example is for those of us who are able and willing to be with our experience in such a profound way. All the great spiritual teachers have done that. All the great spiritual teachers have demonstrated that. And then sometimes I get in my headspace of, I need to be strong.
It's really a familiar programming, especially as a man, you know, to be strong.
Yeah. So how does forgiveness play into this? And I see forgiveness and compassion being so interchangeable in this.
Well, even, you know, Jesus said that, right, when they were crucifying him. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And it's really true that if we could see what someone else has gone through from the beginning of their life to now, then we would completely understand why they did what they did to us. And if we were that person, and if there's no separation and we are one, then indeed we actually are that person. If we were that person, we would have done the exact same thing. And yet we don't want to just have a spiritual concept of forgiveness, because that can be another way of bypassing our pain and the hurt of what did happen to us. And so I think meeting the place of unforgiveness is really important, to see why is it that I don't want to forgive? What is it that I'm holding in here? What hurt, what story, what blame is held in here? Or what boundary do I need? Because people have done atrocious things, and maybe someone did something atrocious to us. I mean, there's all kinds of violence and rape and abuse and molestation that has happened, that to forgive that person, that sounds insane, because to forgive would be to condone the behavior. But we're not talking about condoning the behavior. Sometimes we need unforgiveness to have a boundary until we're ready to say, okay, I can have that boundary without continuing to hold this burden of resentment and hatred towards you, knowing that the burden of resentment and hatred towards you harms me more than it harms you. So, you know, there's that bumper sticker that says, forgive for your sake. You know, not even for the other person's sake, but also forgive because we don't know what karma that we're playing out with that soul, what we're helping to transmute. The work of forgiveness actually means to feel it all the way down to the core until we don't actually have to forgive, because it falls apart by itself. And then forgiveness is a natural byproduct of doing our work.
Thank you. That is absolutely just resonated completely with me. That this isn't about me forgiving someone else. Because in that framework of forgiveness, there's automatically judgment. Because
Right,
if I'm
exactly.
forgiving you, it means that I know
You did
you've
something
done
wrong
you've
and
done
bad.
something wrong and
Right.
bad, and I'm going to forgive you for that. And I love what you said, that this is really about us really feeling very deeply the experience. And what happens
And
when we
taking
step into that.
responsibility for whatever our part was. Maybe our part was only 3%, but that's the part that we could take responsibility for. And we could see how we might have generated that experience, how we might have brought that into our field, what we might have been learning, what was the chess move that God was making. Yeah.
Well, you're not going to believe this. We actually are out of time again.
You need a longer show, TJ.
Yes,
because we're
I
just
think
getting
so.
warmed
But
up.
in the meantime, I'm going to ask you to come back next week,
Okay.
if you will,
Yes.
because next week is Easter.
Yes.
And I would love to actually spend
have
more
our
time
resurrection, on the resurrection.
to talk about the
On
resurrection.
the other side of
Yeah.
all of this healing work.
Yeah, so if you're willing to do that, I'd love to have you
Yes,
back next
I
week.
would love to. It's
So-
an honor.
Thank you. In closing, why don't you take a few minutes to tell our viewers how to find you?
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for watching the show. And if you'd like to hear more, you can go to my website, ashannasolaris.com. And if you'd like to find out more about my work with Clarity Breathwork, you can visit claritybreathwork.com. You can also find our videos on YouTube if you look for Clarity Breathwork.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ashanna, for joining us this evening. And thank you, the viewers, for joining us to really have this conversation about spirituality in the 21st century and what it means. And I invite each of us now, as we approach this week of Easter, to recognize how important every part of the journey is. And for myself, what I recognize is that I'm not living in what I might call tomb time this week, so that there will be a resurrection. Perhaps a greater meaning is simply so I can learn how to be with myself, with compassion, with love, with joy, even in the tomb. Perhaps many of us, I know in my case, I was taught exactly the opposite of that, that this is not about feeling my feelings deeply. This is about pushing them away and being strong and finding a way to deal with or to transmute. This, for me, this week, what this represents is an opportunity for me to live the principle of self-love and self-compassion wherever I'm at any moment. And from that place of vulnerability and authenticity, connecting with others. In much the way Ashanna did today in her beautiful rendition of the story that she shared, and I immediately felt more connected. So my invitation in closing is to find a way to access that deeper vulnerability. Find a community of people to connect with. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please join us at Awaken Living for an upcoming event. We have a Sunday morning gathering, we have a Saturday morning group. For more details, visit us at awakenlivingsf.org. Thank you, and good night.